Okay, well, I think we'll make a start, Nina. We're just a minute past 10:30. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's UKATA webinar on ADR. My name's Kellyanne, and I'll be hosting the session and just ensuring that everything runs smoothly. We've had a lot of interest in this webinar, and it's great to have such a good turnout. So I think the last time I checked, we're just over 300 of you joining us today. Which is fantastic. So thank you, everyone. So just before we get started, I just want to go through a few housekeeping points. So this webinar is being recorded and a copy will be made available afterwards. I will email you all with the link to the webinar, and you will receive that today. If you do have any questions, and I'm expecting that there will be some questions, can you please ensure that you use the Q&A box and not the chat box? We don't want to miss any questions and we want to keep them all in the same chat box. We're going to address as many questions as we can today during the Q&A session. We just need to be mindful that we do have an hour or so. So any unanswered questions, we'll send them over to Nina. Nina's kindly offered to answer them and get back to us. One more point, so if you are experiencing any technical issues, it'd be best if you try refreshing your browser, or if you can reconnect by logging out and then logging back in, that'd be great. So I think if we can get started, I am pleased to announce our speaker today, Nina. So thank you for joining us today, Nina. We're really looking forward to hearing your insights on ADR and how it impacts the industry. So without further ado, I will pass over to you, Nina.
No, thank you very much. It's really, really great to see so many people on this morning. It's incredible. Okay, my name is Nina Day. I work for HSE and HSE's transport sector, and I'm the technical lead for road transport generally, and particularly for CDG ADR. I've been in HSE for quite a long time now. This year is my quarter century in HSE, and I'm genuinely quite happy that for most of my career I've worked in road transport since 2007, and it is genuinely such a fun sector to work in because it's a challenge. I know that there are lots of issues that you guys are facing, lots of quite challenging issues, and it's always a pleasure to work with people who are so committed to getting things right, and I think that's reflected in how many people are on today. So I'm going to run through various points about the changes to ADR in ADR 2025 from an HSE perspective, and how those changes interact with various other areas. I wanted to keep my slides fairly to the point because I know there probably will be quite a lot of questions, and I want to give you as much opportunity as possible to ask those questions. So hopefully, without any technical issues, I'll be able to share my slides with you, and hopefully you can all see those.
Yeah, I can see that, Nina. And
that's good. I'll take that as a yes. You can all see those. Okay. So there have been some changes in ADR 2025 around the transport of asbestos in bulk, and the raw changes are set out here. There's a new SP 678 and new provisions AP 12 and CV 38. And these allow for the carriage of bulk waste in certain circumstances in container bags. The requirements for transport documents have also been amended to reflect those changes. So those are the bold changes, if you like, in relation to the transport of bulk waste. What that means in terms of 678, and I will say I want to go through the detail of this. I will go on to talk about how this interacts with other matters. So what that actually means in terms of transporting bulk waste, you can use large container bags that do not have to be UN approved. They don't have to be manufactured to a particular standard. They have to be suitable. There have to be 2 layers. They have to be dust tight. But it's not defined strictly that they have to be to a particular standard. In particular, they have to be resistant to foreseeable damage in transit and during unloading. So then they're not going to have an easy life. They are going to have a fairly rough life, so they should be strong enough to resist foreseeable damage during handling, during unloading. They must be loaded into a high-sided container, and that is to protect the sides of the bag and keep the integrity of the bag. If the bag is the size of the load compartment, so it must fill the load compartment, it doesn't have to be sheeted as well, as long as you've got that single container bag that is zipped nice and tight, it's dust tight, it doesn't have to be sheeted in addition. Again, the strength of the load compartment is not defined. There's no standard for it. It says it must be of sufficient strength for the intended use. The bags are a single-use system, so you can't reuse them. It is a single use, and they should be loaded by mechanical means. Whatever the capacity of the bags, the total mass of the load cannot exceed 7 tonnes. And each shipment is a full load. So you can't load a bag and then start loading other things as well. That is a full load. A key point, I think, is there must be no intermediate handling. So you load the bag, you take it to the disposal site. You can take it to an intermediate site and store it, but you can't handle it. It is only handled when it goes on and handled when it comes off, and that's it. So that's the breakdown of how 678 works. This is what the container bags look like. They do fill the load compartment. They are one unit, one item. As I said, you don't have to sheet these. Once they're in the container, they don't have to be sheeted. They can be transported as is. One thing I think that I really find a challenge in road transport generally, and I think a lot of people do, is that it is complicated because you have different areas of legislation that apply and different regulators. Even if you are just moving a box of non-hazardous widgets down the road, there are multiple bits of legislation that apply and you're dealing with multiple regulators. And that's before you throw dangerous goods into the mix as well. So while we are here talking about ADR, I think it is really important not to forget that there is a bigger picture. There is other legislation that applies as well. We've got the Health and Safety at Work Act, we've got CAR 2012, and we've got construction and use regulations, and all of those interact. And I think we've got to be really careful that we don't focus solely on ADR to the exclusion of the others. That's where problems tend to come in. We manage risk much better, we transport much more efficiently if we look at that big picture. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, because I know that some of the queries that have come into HSE and some of the discussions that we've had with other regulators have been about the interaction between ADR and those other areas of legislation. And one of those is the construction and use regulations. Now, this is quite a long-standing bit of legislation. The construction and use regulations date from 1986. But the enforcement approach changed quite significantly in 2021, and the new enforcement approach was introduced in May 2022, and DVSA released new guidance on that in 2023. Now, where this relates to the ADR 2025 changes is that the enforcement approach says that if you're carrying loads in an open vehicle or an open container, you've got to cover it, which has either got to be by a rigid cover, a solid cover, or a sheet. And by that, I mean a tarpaulin, not a net. Or you've got to use webbing straps or something similar to that, and the sides of the body alone are not sufficient. And not covering is in itself a PG9 prohibition defect. Now, for an operator, obviously that's a concern because a PG9 prohibition defect will affect the OCRS. However, if you are transporting under 678 and only under 678, that single large container bag does not have to be separately sheeted. It does not have to be separately covered. Generally speaking, waste does have to be contained. It does have to be within a box. It does need to be covered. But if you are transporting under 678, the container bag itself will count as the sheeting under construction and use. So the guidance does need amending to reflect that, and it will be in the future. But in practical terms, at the moment, the container bag is acceptable. So I wanted to just run through an example of transporting asbestos cement sheet. So AC can be transported under SP168 if it's in good condition. It has to be wrapped. So CAR 12 requires them to be double wrapped in heavy duty polythene. How feasible it is to wrap dictates how they're wrapped. So sometimes it's possible to wrap 2 or 3 sheets manually before loading, or they have to be moved unwrapped mechanically into a skip and wrapped that way, a pre-lined skip. It will entirely depend on the circumstances. The key thing is that you have that 2 layers of wrapping and the solid container. But SP168 doesn't apply if your asbestos cement sheets are not in good condition. If they're broken, if they're weathered, if they're badly damaged, you can't transport them under 168. 678 applies to loads that are contaminated with asbestos, and ADR gives you 5 very distinct examples of what that means. So that could be soil, it could be furniture from a building, PPE, RPE, equipment from damaged buildings and construction sites. So it's contaminated with, not product itself. If neither of these cases apply, if neither SP applies, you transport the load in a double-lined skip with either the solid roof or the robustly secured non-rigid cover, so a roll top. A load that you don't cover like that is likely, it is an insecure load under construction and use, and that would attract the PG9. It's got to be covered. So that's an example of the robust covers that you could use, roll top cover. That's perfectly acceptable. So that would be acceptable under ADR, it'd be acceptable under CAR 12, and it's acceptable under C&U. And this is what I mean by the whole picture. It's really important to look at those different areas, think about what's actually in the load, what's going to happen to the load throughout the journey, not just at the point of loading, but what's going to happen to it all the way through. How is this going to be protected from damage? Where is the risk to other people, to workers on the site, to members of the public, and how can those risks be managed? It is so important to look at the whole picture. If you are moving under SP168, you don't have to comply with full ADR. However, you still need the warning label under CAR 12, and that's an example of the warning label. And again, the load still needs to be covered. There's no exemption there. The only exemption from construction and use is for that single large container bag under SP 678. Anything else, the load still needs to be covered, either in a box or it's got a robust sheet over it. Okay, so I've run through that quite quickly and quite briefly because I know we're going to have lots of questions and I want to leave as much time as possible for those.
Well, thanks, Nina.
I'll put myself back on.
Wow. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to head over to the Q&A box. So anyone that hasn't asked a question so far, please feel free to do so. So we'll start with the first ones that we've had. So Steve has asked, can more than one bag be transported in a container? One of the photos seem to suggest this.
If you're transporting under 678, that's a full load. The container bag is a full load. You can't start putting other things in. It's just the container bag in the container.
Thanks, Nina. We'll go on to our next question. So this question is from Chris. Weather sheets, surely all roof sheets are weathered?
It's the degree of damage. So as with everything, it comes down to the assessment of risk. Is it in reasonable condition? Is there a danger of fibres coming out? Where is the risk to other people? If you've got damaged sheets, and you can see fibres, there's obviously an issue. It's got to be an assessment on the day. I can't sit here at my desk and say, okay, this is the black and white, this is what you do in every situation. It's got to be an assessment at the site. Are these in good enough condition that we're confident there's no risk, or the risk is very minimal?
Well, thank you, Nina. Okay, so Steve has another question. He's asking, can you just explain again the process if neither SP applies to AC?
I'm just seeing if I can go back in. There we go. So if you're not running under 168 or 678, you're going back to those basic principles of double wrapping and in a box, essentially. So it's either in a skip that's got a roof, a solid roof, or it's a container where it's got a robust cover, so a roll top, for example. The key point, and I think it's a fundamental principle, unless there is another exemption like the 678 container bag, it is double wrapping inside a box.
Lovely, thank you. We have another question, and this question's from Duncan. Will the transporting of asbestos contaminated soils continue as previously understood, such as solid robust sheets are not used in the bag?
Well, it's again, are they wrapped properly? Is there a danger? Where's the risk? In terms of the definitive answer, that is something that we're working on at the moment. I mentioned that, there are multiple areas of legislation here, there are multiple regulators, and I think in terms of a clear position, and I'm not just saying this, to be deliberately obstructive or anything like that, but we want to be really clear for people. So, for example, HSE we're working on our guidance to update that so that everybody has a clear picture in our guidance. The DVSA guidance also needs to be updated to give people the clear view of what they can and can't do.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Wayne has asked a question. I assume the police are going to look for the orange marker boards for transporting any hazways, e.g. SP 168 or SP 678.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Jordan's asking, just to clear up, when transporting sheets deemed to be in a good condition, is solely a large container bag suitable, or does it need to be covered?
If you are transporting under 678 and you've got that single container bag and there's nothing else in there, you do not need a separate cover. The container bag is sufficient and it will be compliant under ADR and it will be compliant under construction and use as well. I say the guidance has not been updated to reflect that yet, but it will be. It's an agreed position among the regulators.
Thanks, Nina. Okay, so the questions are coming through now. Just let me have a look that I'm going in some sort of order. Okay, so Heidi, with the 17 limit per bag, how do we estimate the weight of the load when on site?
That is a really good question. And that's one I'll come back to you with. There are some fantastic questions in there. I'm just looking back through. I think that's going to be one of the ones that we'll come back to you with.
Okay. Thanks, Nina. Like I say, any questions that are unanswered, I will get them together and send them across and dispute them as appropriate. Okay, so a question from Matt. If you have a couple of weather damage sheets that have been double wrapped and then placed into the container bag with the good sheets, is this acceptable?
Is it one of the use cases in 678? Because it's a very definitive list in 678 of what you can transport under that SP.
Okay.
So, as I say, I shall just pulling up my book actually so I can read it. It gives you, this very definitive list: solid waste from roadworks, contaminated with free asbestos, soil contaminated with free asbestos, objects, for example, furniture contaminated with free asbestos, material from damaged structures which cannot be packed in accordance with the packing instructions, and construction site waste contaminated, which again, because of their size and mass, can't be wrapped in the usual way. That's it, that's the list. So if your waste falls outside that, you can't use 678.
Okay, we move on to the next question. So Duncan, Nina, how do you see remote demolition techniques for multi-layer roof covers? How are we to load, e.g. bag or wrapped bin, bag will need reprocessing and multi-handling?
So I'm just looking back for where, oh, I see it, yeah.
Yeah, Duncan, about 4 minutes ago, we asked the question.
Oh yes, I found it now, yeah. I think that's one I'll come back to you with, Duncan.
I'll just make a note of that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so Paul, so EM9 of the HSG 210 states, it is not good enough to throw a sheet over a standard skip, and shows an image of not dissimilar to your images. Oh man, it's just gone. The question, 1 second.
No, I've got it.
Have you?
I've got it, that's all right. I was just looking at that actually, because that is another good question. I think, that's a nice example of where we need to update our guidance to make sure that it reflects current practice. There's quite a bit of updating that needs to happen. As I say, DVSA guidance needs to be updated as well to reflect those changes. We did make some minor amendments last December, but it needs to be updated more substantially.
Thank you. Okay, so Chris Ivy, can you define free asbestos, please?
Sorry, I missed that because I was coughing.
Oh, bless you. No worries. So Chris Ivy's asked a question. Can you define free asbestos, please?
You're putting me on the spot now.
They're going to, these questions took a long time coming.
In relation to what? In terms of quantities or concentration?
We can, I mean,
I don't know if we can.
The next question, if Chris,
yeah,
as you want to expand on your question in the chat, Q&A, please.
Sorry, I do apologise for the coughing. It's disease at the moment, I'm afraid.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we'll go to the next question. What are the lower limits of contamination where SP67 applies? In CAR 2012 guidance, asbestos is defined as containing more than trace amounts.
Sorry, I didn't catch the start of the question.
That's okay. So what are the lower limits of contamination where SP67 applies? In CAR 2012 guidance, asbestos is defined as containing more than trace amounts.
Just looking back for that question.
It was, about 3 minutes ago.
I can see, the last one got threshold 0.1, but that's Wayne.
I'll pin it to the top. If you go to the top of the Q&A, it should be
okay.
pinned.
Oh yeah, got it now.
Yeah.
There we go. So, I was going to say again, if we go back. Sorry, I'm going. So I'm getting my voice back a little bit. That's better. So with any of this, as I said before, it's difficult for me sitting at my desk to say, oh yeah, when you're on site, do this. I think a full answer is going to be a written one. When we go back with the questions, we'll do a full answer in that. But I think you've got to look at the actual site situation, what you're dealing with on site. Where is the risk? You may have a product that's in pretty good condition. It's old, it's weathered, but it's in good condition, and there's no real risk of fibres coming out. We think, that it's unlikely that there's any danger there, and you can treat that as relatively low risk. And having written guidance myself, that's my feeling. If you look at ADR 2025 and the changes in 678, where they're coming from with that is that we are looking at products where the risk is considered to be relatively low. So it is practicable to say, actually, we can stand for it to be transported in this way. It doesn't have to be full ADR. We don't think that's proportionate to the actual risk. And, I mentioned this interaction of legislation earlier. I think if you always bring it back to the HSWA principles, the Health and Safety at Work Act, is there a risk assessment in place? Have you thought through the actual risks? What are we dealing with? Are there free fibres? Is there severe damage to this AC sheet? That's a high risk load and it needs to be moved properly. Whereas if we're dealing with something, the contamination is incidental. And, I've been involved in the investigation of incidents where there has been incidental asbestos contamination. And you deal with that for what it is. There is a risk there, but it is not as acute as if you are dealing with damaged asbestos sheet, for example. So I think the full answer is going to be a written one because it'll probably be quite lengthy.
Yeah, of course.
That's the short version.
Well, thank you. Okay, so I'll pin the next question at the top of the chat box. So this one is from Victoria. So Victoria's asking, what is the low quantity limit used for small amounts of asbestos coveralls used by surveyors or maintenance trades, creating minimal waste such as drilling textures, decorative coating to install a smoke detector for resistance. So that should be pinned at the top, Nina, if you can see it.
Oh, I see it, yeah. Again, I think ones like that, we're going to do those as the written answer.
Okay.
And we'll just do that as a generic, these are the limits, and do it that way. And then it's all, people have got it all together.
Yeah, not a problem.
Rather than it being bits and pieces.
There's quite a few questions, so I'm just, the chat box is the Q&A is a bit.
It's got a bit jumbled.
Yeah, let's have a look. It's just questioning a little bit.
I think with any of these, I think, it's really important. And I actually meant to put this in the slides earlier. We've got to remember with 678, this is talking about contamination. It's contaminated items and contaminated material. So it doesn't apply to asbestos cement sheets, for example. It is purely for that, as I mentioned, it's that incidental contamination. So your workwear, your PPE, your RPE, if you've got furniture from a building that's being demolished, there's incidental contamination, and that comes under 678. It's not for asbestos product itself.
Okay, so I've pinned the next question, and this is from Adrian. When the wet and drop method is carried out in demolition of AC roof sheets, how do you see the regs being interpreted as regarding to transporting the waste in skips in regards to lining covering the skips?
If it's actual asbestos product, it's not going to come under 678. It's going to stand as is, and it's going to come under construction and use, which is lined skip with a solid roof. So 2 layers in a box. And I see the question now. Sorry, it's just popped up at the top for me.
I think It's been a bit slow just because obviously there is a lot of questions, so please bear with us for the technical delay.
That's a shame because I just saw a really good one popping up actually, and I've lost it now. It was further down.
Oh, we can. Okay. So the next one's pinned. I've done that again, so it's at the top. So Emily, Emily would like to know, what do you class as a bulk load? Can 1,000 kilograms bonded still be transported and moved into the enclosed skip under the non-waste framework directive exemption number 3 prior to being taken to the end facility?
Well, the changes, again, it is purely about the incidental waste. There's no changes to anything else. So it's exactly the same as it was before. It's a good question. I think there's so many. I keep seeing really good questions coming back.
Yeah.
I think it would actually be useful, if we could, maybe get a document with all the questions and just run through them to make sure we haven't missed any, because I can see some really good ones going past.
Can you recall who asked the question, Nina?
I can't. I say there's so many going past. I can see that there's some fantastic ones in there, and it would be useful, I think, just to make sure that we haven't missed anything that's really important.
So
I mean, I like the flow. I was going to say the one that the comment that Christian made about the flow charts with the different routes. I really like that. I think that's a really good idea and worth doing. It was 12 minutes ago, Christian Jones.
I found it, Nina. Yeah. So, Christine Jones. So we've pinned that at the top. It would be useful if the flow charts could be produced with the different routes that you will go down in some possible scenarios. Is that the one that you recall?
That's the one. I think that's a fantastic idea.
Yeah.
I think that would be a really good way of it. Yeah. And bring a lot of clarity to things, I think. I say that there are some really, really good ones there.
There's a lot. I think my Q&A might be a little bit slow, like I said. But
it is, I think. It's jumping around a little bit as well.
Yeah. Let's have a look. I mean, if there's any in the meantime that you can see, Nina, I can try and put it. I think because there's that many, I am going to ask Ray to jump on if that's okay.
So I've just, before we go to that, I just seen one for me and asking if the written answers will be available to everyone. I think that's quite important, actually.
Oh yeah, definitely.
If we go, it's not just going to be to individuals. It's
no. We'll send that to everyone.
I am on to one. There's quite a lot of questions coming through, so I just wanted to maybe quickly roll through some of these. Can you mute me? So when transporting soil and stone with incidental cement found asbestos, would you need the polythene sheets for such a low concentration of asbestos? Sorry, Nina's muted now.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, how far back is it?
You can still hear us, can't you, Nina?
I can still hear you. Yeah, I was just looking for it.
Yeah, so when transporting soil and stone with incidental cement-bound asbestos, would you need the polythene sheets for such a low concentrations of asbestos?
If you're transporting under 678, it would go in the container bag. So it's a 2-layer container bag that completely fills the load compartment. I say, as long as you're complying with 678, you don't need anything else.
Yeah,
it's those 2 bags and the container.
Okay. Duncan, there is enormous grey areas between the regulations and view by the regulator for cement bonded materials, EA, road, traffic, HSE. You said you want to be clear, but you dodged my last question and I don't have an understanding for soils.
I think it's not me trying to deliberately dodge it. It's more that at the moment we have a lot of guidance, and this isn't, one regulator in particular. We have a lot of guidance that isn't up to date. And I've just seen another question actually that somebody else has asked about these changes and being stopped by the police because the guidance is out of date, which is a fair point. That this does mean big changes, and we need to get it updated, and we need to make sure that everybody understands it. And I appreciate for the industry, it is a grey area at the moment, and it's not something I say with any pleasure, that it is like this at the moment. It's what it is, and we are working to fix it. I think HSE is doing quite a lot in this area. We're updating our guidance. We're trying to work with the industry. We're working with other regulators, and as soon as we can bring that clarity, we will do. It's not something we're sitting on our hands and we're complacent about. We know it's a problem. We know that there's confusion. I know from my own discussions with the police, it's something that they are aware of. As with anything, and I think if people have an issue, if they have concerns, if they have specific problems with what they're doing, ask the question. Whether that's to HSE or to somebody else, query it. And I would say this is a constant thing in transport generally. Quite often people do have a problem. Something doesn't go the way that they think it should, but they don't say anything. And so nobody knows about it. Whereas if you come to a regulator and say, I don't think this is right, or I think it should work like this, well, sometimes people have a point. And I know I've done that in the past. I've changed guidance, I've amended guidance because somebody has quite rightly said, actually, that doesn't work. Or that's not what we did. Fair enough. You've got a good point. We'll make the change. So I would say, until it is crystal clear, or even after it's crystal clear, if someone thinks, actually, I've been told the wrong thing, I've been enforced on, and it's not correct, you need to raise that. You might be right. And if you are, it can be dealt with.
Thanks, Nina. Next question. It seems to us, this is from Heidi, it seems to us that for the types of waste covered by SP 678, the only option now for packaging are UN approved bags, such as the 1 ton bags available, or the container bags. I don't see circumstances where polythene is allowed anymore other than for the whole sheets. I think this all needs clarifying in some guidance.
Oh no, I would agree with you with the guidance. I think the option is there for 678. And I always say this, I say this to people quite a lot. There's nothing to stop you going above and beyond, if you like. As with anything, guidance is a minimum. I write a lot of guidance for, say, DVSA. Guidance is a minimum. And as a regulator, we will say, well, this is the minimum that you need to do to comply with the law. There is nothing to stop you saying, actually, we want to do this because we think it's safer. And I quite regularly deal with operators who do exactly that. They say, great, that's the minimum. We're not doing it. It's not good for our business. We're going to go above that.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, the rules are as they are. They're the minimum, and the guidance is the minimum. If you think that's the wrong approach and you want to do something different, absolutely. You're quite welcome to come and ask us about it as well. If you have, particular concerns that that's the right way to go.
Thanks, Nina. Question from Dan. How does the hierarchy of waste apply in relation to the transport of asbestos impacted soils to permitted treatment facilities?
I was just looking and thinking that would be another flowchart one, because again, I think Christian suggested absolutely, yeah, brilliant. That's something that we need to put in, is get the flowcharts in these circumstances. This is what applies. This is what you need to do. And I think that's a really good way of addressing it. And then it's clear to people. I think, pictures, flowcharts are far more useful to people than pages and pages of words.
It's a lot clearer.
Yeah.
Just the question we had earlier from Chris about defining free asbestos is a bit more content added underneath. The new information keeps referencing contaminated with free asbestos. So are we saying freely moving, not bonded in a matrix?
The way that it's defined, or the way that it's written in ADR, I mean, I think 678, you could interpret things in different ways. And I know, again, having written guidance myself, what seems very clear to you when you're writing something is you assume that other people will interpret it in the same way, and they don't necessarily. And that's not their fault, it's your fault for not writing it properly. in my view, or it's not clear to everybody. I think that we need to put some clarity on what we mean, or what is meant, we think is meant by it, because I think as written, perhaps you could interpret 6, 7, 8 in different ways.
Okay.
So I think a clear definition would be helpful to industry.
Next one was from Tony. Would it be easier to remove SP168 as all asbestos sheets are in some shape or form broken? When can SP168 legitimately be used?
Again, I think you don't have to use it. It's an option there. If you have asbestos that is genuinely in pretty good condition and the risk is not there, then you can use SP168. The option is there. You don't have to use it. Again, you might take the view, actually, for us as a business, we think that's pointless. We don't think that's helpful to us. We're just not going to use it. It exists in ADR. I think the key thing to remember about ADR, it's not just a UK document. It's not something that is just written for us. It's inputted into by many, many people. And it's written for different people. So we can only take that as a base document. If people want to say, actually, that doesn't work for me, that's not what we move, we do something else, we think the risk is much higher, then that's what you're dealing with. And I know, people who've joined us today, they're not people who are messing around. They're trying to do things the right way.
Yeah.
And that's the key thing. I think, again, if you go back to that fundamental approach of what's the risk? How can we manage that? Don't just aim for the minimum you can get away with. It's, are you managing the risk properly? And that's the key thing.
Thank you. Sam Lord, she just mentioned ADR does not define free asbestos.
No. And this is what I mean. There's a lot of, say, not grey areas as such, but things are not nailed down.
Yeah. Another one from Steve. Regarding containment procedures, can a piece of steel work with sprayed blue asbestos on it if found among construction debris and because of its size cannot be packaged in readily available UN packaging, be put in a container bag for disposal?
So it's asbestos product, or it's yeah. I don't think that could really go in the container bag anyway. That needs to be in a double lined skip.
Okay. A question from Rob. Let me just expand it. Where current guidance needs updating, will HSE release a cover letter we can refer to should an enforcement officer or traffic officer attempt to issue notice by referring to outdated guidance legislation in relation to the transportation of asbestos under these special provisions outlined today?
That was actually the comment I was reading
when
I replied a few minutes ago, because I was thinking, that is a good point. Yeah. And again, I think, the key thing is, guidance needs updating. But, in the meantime and afterwards, if people disagree, then raise the question. Say, is this right? And that's true of anything. Sometimes people have a point, sometimes they don't. But the discussion can't happen if people don't say anything. And, that they're just sitting in their office, it's not fair, we got enforced on. Ask the question. If you don't think it's right, challenge it, and there can be a discussion there.
Okay, lovely. A question from Phil Richardson. Can we use double-lined 40-yard skips as we as a company remove asbestos cement roof sheets from factories? Okay,
so we're double wrapping in a box again.
Yeah.
For our asbestos products. And that's the key thing. I think from a safety perspective, that should always be your first principle. Your double layers of wrapping and inside a rigid container, inside a rigid box. And that's the key thing. So I think a lot of these flowcharts are going to be the simple answer to a lot of these.
Yeah.
If we have examples of situations, we can say, actually, in this scenario, do this, follow this path.
Yeah.
Because I've just seen another one, actually, and I've seen a few of these where, again, people are talking about putting asbestos products into the container bags under 678, and of course you can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's for the contaminated or incidental contamination of other items. It's not for the AC sheets.
Yeah.
It's for the soil. It's for PPE, things like that. So I think having those very, very clear flow charts are probably the key here.
Okay. Another question from Charlie. With cement, asbestos in soil, if moving under SP 678, 7 ton is a very small volume to transport when a tipper can hold 19 ton, especially when working on large projects. Is this 7 ton of asbestos in the load, or 7 ton total, including soil in the load? And then there's a couple of comments just underneath to say, I agree, a very low weight limit, and tipper lorries are significantly higher than 7 tons and can be up to 18 tons. So
if you're running under 678, it's a maximum of 7 tons, and that's in the container bag. It doesn't matter what the capacity of the container bag actually is. The container bag has got to be filled with 7 tons or less. You can't go above that, and it must be the only load. But you don't have to run under 678. You know, a 678, again, you know, we're coming back to 168. 678 is an option. But if you think, actually, we want to move more than that, you know, quite rightly, you might have a much bigger quantity. Fair enough, but you can't run under 678.
Okay. Question from Ravi. Is there any additional special rules, regulations that apply for asbestos or ATMs found on ships, merchant vessels?
I saw that
quite
one
specific questions.
Yeah. I was going to say, so I did see that one earlier. And I was thinking, actually, that's one I would like to come back to, just because I think that's one where I would need to liaise with a different regulator again, because ships are a different case to road transport, and I need to make sure that we're not crossing over somebody else as well.
Yeah.
Somebody just put their hand up. I don't know if that was accidental or not.
Not sure. I don't think
okay, it might have just flashed up and gone again.
Yeah, they're all
That's fine.
disconnected. A question from Howard. If a contractor was clearing fire damage waste from an asbestos roofed warehouse, could the material be loose loaded into a bulk load bag under SP 678, albeit with a 7 ton weight limit?
Are we talking about actual asbestos product here, or is it just contaminated items? And, you know, I've seen this play out quite recently, so I know the scenario. If it's incidental contamination and big pieces of, say, roof sheets, roof tiles have been picked out, and it's just the incidental contamination, then you could put it in a container bag. But it's whether that 7 tons is enough for the amount of waste that you're removing.
Okay.
And how much, you know, are we talking about there being quite big bits of asbestos in there? Can you sensibly transport it under 678, or would it be better to just not use the special provision?
Yeah.
Would that be more sensible? Again, you know, it's one of those things where I think you have to look at what you're dealing with at the time. That's a good scenario, I think, for the flowchart. That's a nice one that we could have in the flowchart, because that is something that happens. It's a good real world example. But I think it's also a good example of you don't have to use 678.
Yeah. A question from Phil. What size are the container bags, and who is the supplier, please? Is it the same material as a dumpy ton bag?
Just having a look at that. ADR does not define it. If you look at the wording again of 678, it is, I don't really want to say vague, because it's not vague as such, but it doesn't define what the bags have to be. It says they have to be fit for purpose. They have to be suitable for the intended purpose. Now, that's quite nebulous in itself. I don't think it's an unusual thing, because there are lots of things where, you know, the legislation, the guidance says that things have to be fit for purpose, but it does make it perhaps more complicated for people, because there isn't we need to have it to this standard. They don't have to be UN. They just have to be fit for purpose and strong enough for the intended use. Now, I know that's not a particularly helpful thing. Whether there is a way of making that more definite at the moment, I don't know. And this is not me being deliberately obstructive. I don't know if that's a position that we can come to, where that's something that we would have to agree with other regulators, whether we can say this is what we expect to see. So that is, I'm afraid, is going to have to be a leave it with me.
Yeah.
Which I don't like doing.
There may be quite a few of those.
Yeah.
A question from Ian. Will you make the written answers available? I think we've answered that.
Yeah.
So we'll put that document together.
Yeah.
Do sealed containers, i.e. hook loader skips, require 4 class 9 plates front and back and each side?
If you're moving under ADR, yeah, you need to comply with full ADR.
Okay. A question from Gareth. ADR requires an uncovered container to comply with chapter 6.11. Are we saying that does not apply to SP 678?
If you are moving under 678, you've got to think about CNU as well for any loads. But if you are moving under 678, you can just have the container bag within the container, which doesn't have to be a closed container. It can be an open skip with the container bag inside, and that's fine. It does not need to be sheeted. And I think that's part of the reasoning behind 678. I am guessing, because I wasn't involved in the writing of it, but I'm guessing that's part of the thinking behind it, because sheeting can introduce its own issues and its own risks. So whether part of the intention was to remove that and say actually the container bag by itself is okay. As I said, there is, from a regulatory position, there's an agreement between the regulators in the UK that that's also acceptable under CNU. So it's not a PG9 defect to just have the container bag within the open container, and that will be acceptable. But if you start then throw it, but this is what I talked about, the interplay of different things, because the container bag is intended to be a single item. You can't then start putting other things as well. That's also true of the CNU exception rather than exemption. If you started throwing in other things along with that container bag, then that would probably bring you into breach of CNU if you didn't cover the load.
Yeah.
It's not a nice clear line.
Yeah.
You've got to think about all of these different areas. And again, I think these flowcharts are the way to go with this.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I think, Ian made a good point that, it's talking about the bulk transport things, but it's trying to do it in a practical way. It's saying, look, if you've got a quantity of waste that in itself, it's not actually asbestos product, it's incidental waste, here is a way that you can transport it slightly easier. You don't have to go down the full ADR route. You can transport it in this way instead. And it's giving you that option to do it. You don't have to do it that way. And there are other things that you need to think about. It's just providing you with that option.
Yeah. Another question from Heidi. So we are saying that broken asbestos cement sheets from mechanical demolition, no longer in a matrix and therefore potentially free asbestos fibres, will not be expected to be transported in a container bag and only have to be put in a lined skip covered.
Ooh. Sorry, I'm just looking for it's not refreshing for me yet. Give it a minute.
I think 22 minutes ago, Heidi Gibbons.
Here we go. Yeah, if it's asbestos products, it doesn't come under 678. So 678 is purely for that contaminated items, contaminated material like soil, like PPE.
Okay. There's still quite a few questions. So we've got another one from Wayne. When do these ADR 25 changes come into effect, and are there any landfill operators on this chat? And if not, do they know about these changes and what their options are where loads arrive incorrectly packaged?
I don't know if there are landfill operators on this. You might know better than I do on that.
Yeah, not sure. We've had quite a few people registering, but yeah, I don't know if we've got any landfill operators. I know there is some conflict on landfill sites at the minute. Some people are rejecting waste if it's not packaged correctly for what they deem to be correctly, and then other sites are accepting it. So yeah, there probably is some confusion, but yeah, I don't know if there's anyone in the chat.
Heidi has made the good point that AP12 has defined the specification of the bags.
Another question from James. In the proposed the flow chart examples, we need to know the cutoff for where no ADR provisions are required and soils can be transported without any ADR or any special provisions. Line skips, quite a big question. Just use articulated 8-wheelers with cargo net without linings. It's the one that's just come through, James McFarlane. It's probably better if you...
It's all right, mine's not refreshing at all. Ah, here we go. There we go. Just took a minute to come through. Yeah. I mean, all I will say about that, and again, you know, this comes back to the interplay of other legislation. If we're saying, okay, it's not ADR, you still have C&U. And potentially with a cargo net, you could have C&U issues. So that's something, it's a good point. It needs to go into the flowchart. I absolutely agree. It needs to go into the flowchart because it needs to be clear to people what they need to do so that they don't then end up with a PG9 under construction and use because it's not covered in the right way. We can do that. That's easy enough to do.
Okay. Duncan had just commented that landfill operators need to be in here as their interpretation is not as you're suggesting. And then also, Duncan, as a landfill operator, we are not helped by regulators because when it arrives on site, our moral obligation is to accept it because sending it back out on the road is more dangerous. Question from Stephen. Generally, how big are the container bags? Generally, how are the container bags sealed, i.e. big zip, buttons, Velcro, draw cords?
ADR talks about a zipper fastening that's dust tight.
Yeah. I'm just mindful that we have still got a few questions in here, but we are. I'm
just looking at the clock. So many questions.
Mindful of time. We have. We are running out of time. Paul Beaumont had asked, is there a central point of contact to direct inquiries to? If it appears that different bodies, EA, HSE, DVSA, give different responses to questions when asked.
Certainly for HSE, we have a central inquiries team. So queries can be sent to us and it will go to the right people within HSE.
Yeah, just direct them to central inquiries.
Yes. I know DVSA do as well.
Okay. Someone had suggested, given the multitude of questions coming through, obviously this is quite a hot topic at the minute and there's lots of questions. Yeah. Somebody said, is it worth looking at a working group with Nina to cover all scenarios and assist in the production of a flowchart, as per previously mentioned?
I think, you know, we may end up going down that route anyway. I mean, I think particularly the interplay of the different legislation as well. It may be, for example, in the updating of the DVSA guidance, it would be really helpful to have an industry working group to say, this is what we're thinking, this is how we think it works. What do you think? Is this something that is helpful to you? Because that's what we've done in the past. It's what we did for the main DVSA guidance. we wrote a very, very rough draft of how we thought it should be, and it went out for industry consultation. We had working groups, and I think the finished document was considerably better for having that industry input and people saying, actually, we want this to be covered. We want to make sure that that is very, very clear. And again, writing something in isolation, it makes sense to you, and it may make sense to you as a regulator, but how people interpret that is very different. You need that industry view. You need people to say, we need this. You need to make sure that that's covered. So I think that's a good route to go down for the future.
I'll just make this the last question, Nina, because I'm just conscious of time, and then I'll hand back over to Kelly. But we just got, I'm outside, this is from Carol, I'm outside of the industry insurance broker with asbestos removal and demolition clients. So this might be a silly question. What's driving these changes in the regs? Has something happened?
That's a good question. I don't know, to be honest with you, because I haven't been involved in the changes to ADR. I'm catching up with them later, as everybody else is. I can speculate because I think things are done differently in other countries. We are only one member of the committee that makes the changes, so it's not necessarily something that we've put forward or would think about. Other people will put suggestions forward that suit their interests and the way that things are done in their country. As I say, I've not worked on ADR. I have worked on areas of European guidance in the past years ago, and it's very much that people come with their own issues. They might have had incidents in their own countries or issues in their own countries, and they will put something forward and it gets debated. And if you get enough people who think that's a good idea, then in it goes. And it's not necessarily something that is dictated by the UK or is pushed by the UK. We are where we are. How we interpret that in our guidance is a matter for discussion. And I think working with the industry, as I said, I think that's going to be really, really key. HSE does a lot of work with the industry anyway. I know DVSA do. And I think that conversation between us, we can hammer out how we can make this work in this country. But it's got to be a collaborative approach to that, not just HSE or any other single regulator saying this is how it's going to be. It's a collaborative, this is what we think it should look like, and this is how we can make it work in a practicable way.
Yeah, Paul made a good point as well. Just said about picking this up at the Asbestos Network. I think there's a meeting coming up soon. So it'd be something that we can discuss at the network meeting. That'd be a good idea. So
whether we start with a rough outline, again, I've got another area of work that I'm doing at the moment with the industry, and essentially I have just written a rough outline. This is what I think it should be, and I've given it to them and say, okay, you tear it apart. I've given you the framework for it. You tell me what I've done wrong, and between us, we'll end up with a good document.
Yeah,
and I think that's a good way of doing these things. Everybody's got their opportunity to have their say. Everybody's got a useful insight into it, and you end up with much stronger guidance in the end.
Yeah. There is just, sorry, I did say it was the last one, but can this be the last one? So Matt, I know you said that Steve has asked a question that didn't get answered. Unfortunately, we can't answer all questions. There's just too many in the time frame that we've got. But as we said, we will pass these over to Nina afterwards, and we'll try and get a document together. He just said, as ADR is European regs, does the UK still have any say in the content of ADR now we are no longer in the EU?
It's not just EU. I mean, there are quite a lot of countries outside the EU who are also signatories to ADR. We are, as I say, we are just one member.
Yeah.
We have a voice, but we are just one member, and there are a lot of countries who are signatories to ADR, and everybody has their own view on things, their own agenda on things. It's what it is. But what we can do, ADR is what it is, but it is very much up to us how we interpret that in the UK, how we implement that, and how we regulate it. Yeah. And I think that's the point that we need to get to. I had no input into ADR, into the ADR changes. So to a great extent, HSE is catching up along with everybody else about what this means. But I think we can bring something positive out of this and say, actually, this is how it's going to work.
Yeah. Lovely, thank you. Right, I've taken up enough of your time, so I'll hand back over to Kelly to close out the webinar. And thanks for answering as many questions as you have. And we'll, like I said, we'll put it all together and we'll send over the document and get that out to everyone who's attended today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nina.
Thanks, Nina. Very on the spot questions there. But yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. Like Craig and myself said, we will get this together and send it out to everyone that's joined us today. But yeah, so thank you, Nina, and we will close the session now. Just to make you all aware that we do have another upcoming webinar, and that will be on the 11th of March. This will be covering duty to manage. I will share the registration details with them as I email you all. So thanks again, Nina. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Valentine's Day. Take care,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Bye.